Okay, welcome to Chapter 46 in the Practices book. This is all about web services, page 851. So, in the old days, when you wrote an application, you had to install it on all the machines, and then if there was some update, you had to go around to every machine and do an update, right? But if you do it on a web server, you convert this guy to a web application, then everyone just goes to the web, and so there's nothing to install on each machine, and when it comes time to update, all you have to do is just update the web server and presto changeo. Next time anybody clicks on the link, they get the new version. Sure makes life easy, okay, if you convert your thing over to a web device. Okay, so all this stuff is based upon standards, right? Because the whole World Wide Web is built around standards. There's basically two standard committees, the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. Okay, that's really the big one that takes care of all of the things you'd expect, HTML and all the rest of that stuff. The HTML3 and CSS and all that stuff. The other one is the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF. And they're the ones who do the protocols, and they don't run at the same speed. Protocols stay roughly the same for a long period of time. Okay, so simple web services on page 852. Basically, there's several types of web services. You could have what's called a static web page, which means the content is developed one time, put up there, and it rarely changes. Maybe once a week you might go in there and tweak something or add something, but there's no dynamic content. Nothing's being generated on the fly. It's just static content. And that's basically how a lot of them work. So when the webmaster or author updates the web page, everyone gets the new stuff, and if they don't update, they just get the same old stuff every time. The other is dynamic. This used to be CGI, Common Gateway Interface. I don't think anyone ever uses that anymore. In the old days, this was a way that you could plug in, a Python script or a C++ script or something. That basically is just not being used. There's other ways to do dynamic without using CGI. Okay, so this is when content is generated on the fly. So for example, when I did a query on this, if I go to Google, right? So you'd expect, most of this stuff to be roughly static, right? This part. But when I type in, kumquat, clearly I'm not getting static stuff. There's something behind the scene. There was a database search, and it pulled up all this stuff, right? I mean, there's an awful lot of stuff going on. So it requires some sort of programming language. I mean, it could be something you're familiar with. It could be like, C#. Or it could be something called ASP.NET, which is kind of what goes. It could be something called PHP. It could be all sorts of other things. So what language and platform you use to perform this is not really all that relevant to this conversation. But if you were to go and say, I'd like to sign up for a web page, well, then you'd have to basically tell them, hey, what platform do you want? Okay. The third type basically is one of those database generated ones. Well, that's kind of sort of this example, where the content is generated when you do a query. And so this would change whenever somebody changes the price of something or, the whatever, right? And then a multimedia one, basically this is just a place where you put in, videos and pictures and sound files and all those kinds of things, right? Very specialized content. And so it's designed mostly for people to submit things, okay? So the web page is dynamic, that allows you to generate content that it didn't already have. Okay, so let's talk about the LAMP stack, LAMP, L-A-M-P. So because the web stuff is all standardized, you can get a pre-packaged thing. You can download an ISO file that has Linux, that's the L, Apache, which is the web server, MySQL, which is the M, and then PHP or Python. It used to stand for PHP, but now it's like anything. So LAMP, L-A-M-P. You download this thing, it already has it all pre-configured, all this stuff turned on. You could literally take the ISO file, pop it in, for example, in VirtualBox, hit the button, presto changer. You could have a web server up and running in 5 minutes because it's all there. It's all been pre-configured, everything. All you have to do is just add content and you're done. I mean, that's pretty doggone cool. And it's all free, all bundled together in one disk image. Pretty doggone cool. So let's talk about that. Let's say I have a machine and I want to have more than one web page on that one machine. Yeah, that's going to cause some problems. And so, and there's kind of a history lesson here. So let's just start. So on page 853, if everything is small, you could probably get away with having multiple web sites on a single machine. But, you know, scalability is going to require multiple servers, the other way around, right? Instead of having multiple web sites on a single machine, it's a single machine. I mean, a website is on multiple machines. So we're like exactly opposite of what scalability would do. Okay, so let's talk about how we do that. So typically, a service can't share a TCP port, okay? So you may remember that the web runs on port 80 for the normal web page and 443 for the protected ones. But they really can't share a port because that's what the ports are for. The port is for, hey, here comes a packet with port 80. Oh, I need to send that off to the web server, okay? So by default, they were not designed to be shared. So you have to do some trickery. There's a thing called port forwarding, where some piece of software has to look at the TC port and go, I see it's port 80, but hang on, which service does it need? And then if the name matches this string, I'll send it over here. If the name matches this string, I'll send it over there. So that's the way it worked. The new one is called Server Name Identification, SNI. Basically what they went to TCP and made a small tweak to the standard. Now we're back to that engineering task force guy. Okay, and it said, I want to have a way so that when the TCP connection is made, I want to know how to identify the machine that's the web service, not the machine. The web service is actually asking for this, and so they put in SNI. So that's how everyone does multiple scenarios. You guys remember how the certification thing works, where you get a certificate for your SSL? I mean, I should have said HTTPS, but hey, I'm going to go ahead and use the vernacular, even though technically it's not SSL anymore. It's basically designed to show that this IP address is exactly this server, okay? So how can I have two of those? Well, in the old days, you could have what's called a multiple site certificate. Kind of funky. That's just not the way it's done anymore. Now we just use SNI and let it go. Okay, yeah. Okay, so multiple IP address per server for a certificate. Yeah, okay, that kind of sort of works, but it certainly is not scalable. Multiple ports per server. Yeah, you could. I could say, okay, this one is port 80 and this one is port 8000. You could. But to tell you the truth, users are just not used to typing :8000 in the address bar. And so they probably won't. So that's really a bad idea. Don't do that. Okay. So scalable techniques on page 853. So multiple servers with one IP and one port, right? Nothing fancy here, just plain old. Okay. So multiple servers, can they have the same IP address? Not really, right? So, virtual hosting. This is not really an HTTP standard, okay, and it's not well supported, so I wouldn't recommend that. The other one is called a dispatcher, where you have some sort of a traffic cop that sits in and says, oh, I see, this goes over here, that's basically what the SNI does, but you don't need a separate machine to do that. Okay, kind of makes sense? All right. By the way, SNI is supported absolutely everywhere, okay? You don't have to worry about that thing. All right, continuing. So HTTPS on page 854. So multiple domains on the same IP address. Wow. I mean, the whole point of SSL was to verify that when I type in Google, I know that I'm actually arrived at Google. That's what this whole thing is about. I mean, I click on this little guy, it'll basically tell me that, you know, this is the correct thing, you know, and I can look at the entire certificate, you know, all the stuff, okay? And I know that I'm where I'm supposed to be. Well, what happens if you have multiple domains in the same? Okay. So the certificate is using the name and IP address pair, okay? So you could get what was called a multiple domain certificate. That's not a good idea, but they existed. And of course, now we just use SNI. And so therefore, you have the certificate that for each one of those guys, and no one cares, and no one knows any difference. So that problem has been solved. Service level agreement, page 854. So you could have an SLA for the availability, 5 nines availability. You know, and they could tell you when the periodic maintenance is, like we typically do maintenance on Sunday afternoon, that kind of thing. You could have one for latency. You could have one for bandwidth. I get an email from my hosting provider every single time that they're going to have a maintenance outage. Okay? So that's the way mine works. And I don't really have an SLA. They don't guarantee me a performance. Okay? They don't. At least mine doesn't. So monitoring. So if you have a web server up and running, you can look at the logs. IIS produces these very detailed logs, and they have these applications that will run through the log for you and display graphs and all sorts of cool stuff. If you've ever looked at Google Analytics before, that's exactly what we're talking about. It's got some really cool stuff. It's got things like, you know, how many people are coming in from, you know, North America, and how many from South America, and how many from Europe, and what languages are they using? I mean, it could be, for example, that you have an awful lot of, you know, German users that you were completely unaware of. But the logging would tell you this, to tell you what percent of them are German. You might want to go in and go, okay, I need to make a German version of my web page so that they are more comfortable with my stuff. A more practical use is to looking for things like, you know, missing graphics or broken links, things of that nature, right? So if you have a complex website, eventually you're going to click on a link that's not going to work. It's just inevitable. And so this will just record them all, and you go, oh, okay, let me go fix that. Doggone it. Intrusion attempts, yeah. Somebody's trying to break in, not just a normal user trying to access your system, but somebody's using WebDAV, don't worry what that is, or FTP or something that tries to connect to your web server. Also, it can have some performance things like the number of active threads being used, or the per thread memory use. Okay, that'd be kind of cool. Okay, so on page 855, they start talking about scaling for web services. Here's one of those strange stories. If you have good content and you draw lots of users, success brings traffic, and traffic brings overload. Okay, I will tell you that my ISP has moved me from one server to another probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 times. And I would assume it's because I'm generating a lot of traffic, so they move me over here, or I'm not generating hardly any traffic and they move me over here. In other words, they're trying to, it's kind of like physical load balancing, right? Everything is virtualized, so for them to move me from one physical server to another is no big deal. But, you know, this machine is kind of being saturated, bandwidth is being consumed, so they go, let's take that one and move it over here. And so they're trying to do physical load balancing by moving people's contents from one server to another. It doesn't matter what server it is, right? The IP address stays the same, and, you know, all the rest of the stuff. Okay, so one of the things you can do is you could upgrade your hardware. There's some obvious things that you could be doing if you're not hosting it, right? Come on now, if you're going through a hosting provider, well then you could go to them and say, I need more, but typically it's not the way that works. Okay, look, we're coming up on the 15-minute mark.